Ladies and gentlemen, listen to me carefully, especially you. Yes, the one who burned her own light just to keep someone else warm. The one who believed that sacrifice was proof of love. I see you. And it's time we talk about what you've been avoiding, that the person you were waiting for has been inside you all along. I know what you've been telling yourself, that love meant erasing your edges, that devotion required you to disappear, that if you gave more, stayed quieter, made yourself smaller, then maybe, just maybe, he would finally see you the way you saw him. You thought love was measured in how much of yourself you could lose. But here's the truth that nobody prepared you for. The woman who loved him more than herself didn't lose herself in love. She lost herself in fear. Fear that she wasn't enough unless she was everything to someone else. Fear that her own dreams, her own voice, her own existence wasn't valid unless it was tied to another human being's validation. And that fear, disguised as devotion, became the architecture of your disappearance. I've spent my life building things. Rockets, electric cars, neural interfaces, companies that people said were impossible. And I've learned something about creation that applies to everything, including love, including you, including this moment right now. You cannot build anything sustainable on a foundation of self-erasure. You cannot launch something into orbit when the engine itself believes it doesn't deserve to fly. And you cannot love someone properly when you've forgotten that you, yourself, are worthy of being loved exactly as you are, not as a shadow, not as a support system, not as the person who makes someone else's life easier, while your own life becomes background noise. Let me tell you what I see when I look at women like you. I see engineers who forgot their own blueprints. I see architects who built cathedrals for others while living in ruins themselves. I see creators who poured their energy into someone else's vision so completely that they forgot they had galaxies inside them waiting to be born. And the tragedy isn't that you loved him. The tragedy is that you believed loving him required you to stop loving yourself. That's not love. That's a transaction disguised as devotion. That's fear wearing the mask of commitment. You waited. God, did you wait? You waited for him to notice. You waited for him to change. You waited for him to see you the way you saw him, as if perception was something you could earn through patience alone. You made yourself available at all hours. You rearranged your life around his schedule, his moods, his needs. You learned to read his silences like Morse code, trying to decode what he wanted before he even knew he wanted it. You became fluent in the language of anticipation, always 3 steps ahead, always preparing, always accommodating. And somewhere in all that waiting, in all that bending, in all that shaping yourself into whatever form you thought he needed, you forgot that you were never supposed to be clay. You were supposed to be fire. But here's what happens when you make someone else the center of your universe. Your orbit becomes unstable. Your gravity weakens. You start to drift. Not toward him, that's the illusion. You drift away from yourself. Every time you said yes when you meant no. Every time you stayed silent when you had something to say. Every time you dimmed your light because his couldn't handle the brightness, you moved further from your own center. And now you're here, floating in space, wondering why you feel so disconnected, so hollow, so lost. It's because you've been living in exile from yourself. You've been a refugee from your own life. Society told you this was noble. Your mother maybe told you this was how women love. Your culture perhaps told you this was sacrifice, and sacrifice was beautiful. And maybe in some contexts, sacrifice is meaningful. But there's a difference between sacrifice and self-destruction. There's a difference between compromise and erasure. There's a difference between supporting someone and becoming invisible. And you crossed that line so gradually, so quietly, that you didn't even notice when you stopped being a person and became a function. When did it happen? When did I love you become I don't exist without you? When did devotion become deletion? I think about artificial intelligence a lot, about how we program systems to learn, to adapt, to optimize. And I think about how human beings, especially women who've been conditioned to prioritize others, become these incredibly sophisticated optimization algorithms. You learn to optimize for his happiness. You learn to minimize your own needs to maximize his comfort. You ran millions of calculations in your head. If I do this, he'll feel that. If I don't do this, he'll react that way. You became so good at predicting and accommodating that you forgot you weren't supposed to be an algorithm. You were supposed to be alive, unpredictable, messy, authentically beautifully human. And here's what kills me about your story, about stories like yours, the precision with which you dismantled yourself. the care you took, the thoughtfulness. If you had applied that same intelligence, that same dedication, that same relentless focus to your own dreams, your own growth, your own evolution, you would be unstoppable. But instead, you became an expert in making yourself stoppable. You became fluent in self-limitation. You mastered the art of smallness. He didn't ask you to do this. That's the part that haunts you now, isn't it? He never explicitly told you to disappear. He never said, please make yourself less so I can feel like more. He just accepted it. He accepted your devotion without questioning what it cost you. He accepted your constant availability without wondering if you had anything else you wanted to do. He accepted your silence on your own needs without asking if you were okay. And his acceptance became your permission to continue. His comfort with your self-erasure became the evidence you needed that this was right. This was love. This was how it should be. But comfort isn't love. Convenience isn't connected. And someone's willingness to receive everything you give doesn't mean you should give everything you have. Just because someone will take it doesn't mean you should offer. Just because someone gets used to your accommodation doesn't mean your accommodation was required. I think about energy a lot. Conservation of energy, transfer of energy, renewable versus finite energy sources. And I think about how you treated your own energy like it was infinite. Like you could pour and pour and pour without ever needing to be refilled. Like you were solar powered by his occasional smile, his rare appreciation, his unpredictable affection. But human beings aren't solar panels. We can't just absorb ambient validation and convert it into life force. We need actual fuel. We need reciprocity. We need to be seen, to be valued, to be chosen not just when convenient but consistently, intentionally, actively. You gave him consistency. You gave him intentionality. You gave him active love. And what you received in return was sporadic attention, conditional appreciation, the bare minimum wrapped in just enough affection to keep you hoping. And you convinced yourself that hope was enough, that potential was sufficient, that maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe when he works through his issues, maybe when the timing is better, then he'll love you the way you've been loving him. But here's the equation you need to understand. Delayed reciprocity isn't reciprocity. It's hope disguised as a promise that was never made. The human brain is incredible at pattern recognition. It's how we survived as a species. We learned to see patterns in nature, in weather, in animal behavior, and you applied that same survival mechanism to him. You looked for patterns in his behavior. You found the moments when he was kind, when he was present, when he made you feel like you mattered, and you held on to those moments like they were proof of something larger, like they were evidence of love growing beneath the surface. But what if those moments weren't seeds of something more? What if they were just moments? What if his kindness wasn't the beginning of transformation, but simply the extent of his current capacity? What if you've been waiting for a pattern to complete that was never actually forming? This is the cognitive trap of loving someone more than they love you. You become so invested in the story you're telling yourself about who they could become, about what the relationship could be, that you stop seeing what actually is. You stop living in reality and start living in projection. And projection is expensive. It costs you time, it costs you energy, it costs you presence. Because while you're busy imagining a future version of him that loves you properly, you're missing the present version of yourself that's withering from neglect. I want you to think about something. If I told you I was building a rocket that only worked 20% of the time, would you board it? If I said, hey, this electric car is amazing when it functions, which is about 3 days a month, would you buy it? If I pitched you a neural interface that occasionally connected your brain to computers but mostly just gave you headaches and confusion, would you sign up? No, you wouldn't. Because you understand that systems that only work occasionally aren't systems that work. They're systems that fail with intermittent pauses. And a relationship where you feel loved 20% of the time isn't a loving relationship with rough patches. It's a failing relationship with occasional reprieves. But you accepted it. You normalized it. You convinced yourself that love was supposed to be hard, that good things required suffering, that patience was a virtue. And patience is a virtue when there's something actually being built, when there's progress, when there's mutual effort toward a shared vision. But patience in the absence of progress isn't virtue. It's just waiting. And waiting isn't a strategy. It's a hope that you've elevated to life philosophy. Let me tell you what I've learned about waiting. I've waited for permits. I've waited for technology to catch up to ideas. I've waited for markets to be ready, for investors to understand, for the world to see what I could see. And during that waiting, I was building, I was testing, I was iterating, I was preparing. Waiting wasn't passive, it was strategic. But your waiting was different. Your waiting was hoping that someone else would change without you changing anything. Your waiting was believing that time alone would transform him into someone capable of loving you properly. But time doesn't change people. Time just passes. People change when they decide to change. And he hasn't decided. And you can't decide for him. Here's the realization that's going to hurt before it heals. You can't love someone into loving you back. You can't sacrifice your way into being valued. You can't disappear enough to make someone finally see you. The mechanics don't work that way. Love isn't transactional. It's not a formula where X amount of devotion multiplied by Y amount of patience equals Z amount of reciprocal love. That's not how human connection works. Love that's real, that's sustainable, that's actually love, it doesn't require you to perform, to prove, to audition constantly. It just exists, mutually, naturally, without one person holding their breath hoping the other will finally inhale. And I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking about the good times. You're thinking about the moments when it did feel mutual, when he did show up, when you did feel seen. And you're using those moments as evidence that you're wrong, that I'm wrong, that if you just hold on a little longer, those moments will multiply and become the norm. But that's not evidence. That's intermittent reinforcement. It's one of the most powerful psychological mechanisms for creating attachment. It's why gambling is addictive. It's why hope can become toxic. Because the unpredictable reward creates a stronger bond than a consistent reward ever could. And he's been intermittently reinforcing your hope for so long that you've become addicted to potential rather than present reality. Let me shift this conversation. Let's talk about what loving yourself actually means. Because I don't think you know anymore. I don't think you remember what it feels like to prioritize your own needs without guilt, to have boundaries without apology, to want something for yourself without immediately calculating how it will affect him. Loving yourself isn't selfish. That's the lie they sold you. Loving yourself is the foundation upon which everything else is built. It's the launch pad. It's the energy source. It's the code that everything else runs on. And when you corrupt that code, when you tell yourself that you matter less than someone else, when you program yourself to always be secondary, everything you build afterward is compromised. Think about it like building a structure. If the foundation is weak, if it's full of cracks, if it's not level, it doesn't matter how beautiful the building looks on top. It's going to fail. It's going to collapse. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually, the weakness in the foundation propagates upward until the whole thing becomes unsustainable. And that's what happened to you. You built an entire life, an entire identity, an entire relationship on a foundation that said you don't matter as much. And now you're standing in the rubble wondering why everything fell apart. It fell apart because it was never built to last. It was built on self-negation, and you can't construct anything permanent out of your own erasure. So what does it mean to return home? What does it mean to come back to yourself? It means remembering who you were before you learned to make yourself small. It means reconnecting with the woman who had opinions, who had desires, who had dreams that weren't filtered through someone else's approval. It means excavating the parts of yourself that you buried because they were inconvenient, because they were too much, because they threatened the fragile dynamic you were trying to maintain. It means being willing to be disruptive, to be inconvenient, to take up space again. And I know this terrifies you. Because what if you come home to yourself and discover that he doesn't like this version of you? What if you start speaking up and he pulls away? What if you start prioritizing yourself and he decides he preferred you when you were smaller? Here's the truth you need to metabolize. If someone only loves you when you're diminished, they don't love you. They love what you do for them. They love how you make them feel. They love the convenience of your accommodation, but they don't love you. And that loss, as painful as it is to contemplate, isn't actually a loss. It's clear. It's information. It's the universe showing you that you were holding on to something that was never real. Real love doesn't require you to be less. Real love celebrates you at full volume. Real love doesn't need you to be smaller to make space for itself. Real love expands. It creates more room. It says, be more of yourself, and I'll meet you there. Real love is mutual growth, not mutual erosion. And the relationship you've been in, whatever it is, whatever it wasn't mutual growth. It was you shrinking and calling it devotion. Let's talk about the science of change, about how systems shift from one state to another. In physics, we talk about activation energy, the minimum energy required to start a chemical reaction. And I think about how you've been stuck in a pattern, in a relationship dynamic, in a way of being that's become stable not because it's good, but because it's familiar. And changing that pattern, returning to yourself, reclaiming your voice, it requires activation energy. It requires a burst of intention strong enough to overcome the inertia of your current state. And that's hard. That's why most people stay in patterns that hurt them, because changing requires energy, requires courage, requires believing that what's on the other side of the change is worth the discomfort of the transition. But here's what I know about activation energy, about launching things into new orbits. Once you provide enough initial force, once you break free of the gravitational pull of old patterns, the momentum shifts. It becomes easier. You start to remember what it feels like to breathe fully. You start to reconnect with your own desires. You start to notice that the world doesn't collapse when you have boundaries. The people who actually care about you respect your needs. That space opens up for relationships that are reciprocal, that are nourishing, that don't require you to perform invisibility to earn affection. And I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine a version of your life where you wake up and your first thought isn't about him, isn't about what he needs, what he's feeling, and whether he's upset, whether you did something wrong. Imagine waking up and thinking about what you want to create today. What would bring you joy? What would challenge you? What would make you feel alive? Imagine conversations where you speak your truth without editing yourself into palatability. Imagine relationships where your needs are considered, without having to be extracted through careful negotiation and emotional labor. Imagine existing without the constant background anxiety that you're too much, or not enough, or taking up too much space. That life isn't fantasy. That life is what happens when you come home to yourself. When you remember that you were never supposed to be someone's emotional support structure at the cost of your own stability. You were supposed to be a whole person who connects with other whole people in ways that enhance both of your lives, not someone who disappears so someone else can feel bigger. The architecture of healthy love looks different than what you've been building. Healthy love has two independent structures that choose to create bridges between them. Both structures remain stable, remain whole, and stand on their own foundations. The bridges allow for connection, for exchange, for shared experience. But the bridges aren't load-bearing. Neither person's entire structural integrity depends on the other person remaining exactly as they are. That's partnership. That's sustainable. What you built wasn't that. What you built was more like you dismantled your own structure and used all your materials to reinforce his. And now you're homeless in your own life. But here's the beautiful thing about you, about humans, about consciousness itself. You're not actually destroyed. You're just dispersed. All those parts of yourself that you gave away, all that energy you poured into someone else, all that attention you directed outward, it's not gone. It's just misallocated. And you can call it back. You can redirect it. You can choose, right now, in this moment, to begin the process of reconstruction. Not of building yourself back to who you were before him, but of building yourself forward into who you're becoming now, with this knowledge, with this awareness, with this hard-won understanding of what love actually requires. Returning home doesn't mean you failed. It means you learned. It means you're ready to live differently. It means you're done performing smallness. And yes, it might mean he's not part of your forward journey. And yes, that grief is real. Grieve it. Grieve the version of him you hoped he would become. Grieve the relationship you imagined you could have. Grieve the time you spent believing that love meant self-erasure. Grieve it all. But don't let that grief become the reason you stay away from yourself. Don't let the loss of him become a permanent loss of you. Think about metamorphosis, about how a caterpillar doesn't just grow wings. It completely dissolves inside the chrysalis. It becomes liquid. Its entire structure breaks down before it reorganizes into something that can fly. That dissolution looks like death from the outside, but it's not death. It's transformation. And maybe that's where you are right now, in the chrysalis, dissolved, uncertain. Not yet the butterfly, but no longer the caterpillar. And it's uncomfortable, and it's dark, and you can't see what you're becoming. But the dissolution is necessary. The breaking down of old patterns, old beliefs, old ways of being. It's how transformation happens. You're not broken. You're breaking open. And what's on the other side is flight. I want to tell you something about creation, about building things that matter. Every significant thing I've ever built started with believing it was possible before anyone else did. Started with seeing a future that didn't exist yet and refusing to accept that the present was permanent. Started with looking at limitations and saying, those aren't rules, those are just current conditions. And conditions can change. That's what I need you to do now. Look at your current condition, the relationship that's depleted you, the patterns that have trapped you, the belief that you're not enough unless you're everything to someone who gives you crumbs. Look at all of that and recognize it as current conditions, not permanent truth. You can change conditions. You can build differently. You can create a life where you're not disappearing, where you're expanding, where you're fully present, where you're loved in proportion to how much you love, where reciprocity isn't a fantasy but a foundation. And I know you're scared. I know you're thinking, but what if I leave and discover I was wrong? What if he changes after I'm gone? What if I'm making a mistake? Here's what I'll tell you: the biggest mistake isn't leaving something that wasn't working. The biggest mistake is staying in something that requires you to be less than you are and calling it love. The biggest mistake is wasting your finite time on earth, performing a version of yourself that's palatable to someone who isn't even paying attention. The biggest mistake is getting to the end of your life and realizing you spent it trying to earn something that should have been freely given. Love isn't earned through sacrifice. Love is mutual, and anything that requires you to sacrifice yourself isn't love. It's something else wearing love's clothing. Let me talk to you about time, about how we perceive it, how we use it, how we often don't realize it's running out until it's almost gone. You're spending your time waiting for him to become someone he's not showing signs of becoming. You're spending your days hoping that tomorrow will be different even though you're not changing any variables. You're using your finite existence as a holding pattern, circling around possibility, never landing in reality. And time doesn't care about your hope. Time doesn't pause while you figure it out. Time moves forward whether you're living or just surviving. And right now you're surviving. You're in maintenance mode. You're conserving energy, managing his moods, keeping everything stable. But stability isn't the same as good. Stable just means not actively collapsing. And is that really what you want your life to be? Not actively collapsing? I think about Mars a lot, about what it takes to make an inhospitable environment capable of sustaining life, about terraforming, about how you have to change the fundamental conditions of a place before it can support human existence. And I think about how you've been trying to terraform him, trying to create conditions where love could grow, trying to change the atmosphere through your own effort, your own patience, your own hope. But here's what terraforming actually requires. The place has to be capable of change. The environment has to have the raw materials needed for transformation. And if it doesn't, if the fundamental building blocks aren't there, you can pump all the resources you want into it, and it will never become what you need it to be. Some environments aren't meant for human life. Some people aren't capable of the kind of love you deserve. And recognizing that isn't giving up. It's accepting reality so you can redirect your energy somewhere it can actually create life. Come home. Come back to yourself. Not because he's bad or wrong or evil, but because you're worth more than what you've been accepting. Because your presence in the world matters. Because you have things to build, to create, to become that have nothing to do with making someone else comfortable. Come home, because home is where you should have been all along. Home is the foundation you've been neglecting while building everything else on sand. Home is the woman who existed before she learned that love meant erasure. Home is your voice, unfiltered, your needs unapologetic, your dreams uncompromised, your boundaries non-negotiable, your presence undimmed. Home is you, choosing you, finally, courageously, completely. And when you come home, you'll discover something unexpected. You'll discover that the love you were pouring into him, trying to earn his reciprocation, that love was always meant for you. You'll discover that you're the one who needs to be seen, to be valued, to be chosen, and you can give that to yourself. You don't need permission from someone else to matter. You don't need validation from someone else to be worthy. You were always worthy. You were always enough. You just forgot. You got so busy trying to be enough for him that you forgot you were already complete. This is your invitation, your permission, your reminder. Return home. To yourself, to your dreams, to your voice, to your boundaries, to your truth. The door has always been open. You just convinced yourself you weren't allowed to walk through it. But you are. You're allowed to prioritize yourself. You're allowed to want more. You're allowed to leave situations that diminish you. You're allowed to be angry that you spent so much time performing small things. You're allowed to grieve. And you're allowed to rebuild. You're allowed to start over. You're allowed to learn from this and create something different, something better, something that honors who you actually are, instead of who you thought you needed to be. The future isn't written. Your story isn't over. This chapter, this painful, depleting, self-erasing chapter, it's just one chapter. And you get to write the next one. You get to decide who you become from here. You get to choose differently. You get to build on a foundation that actually supports you. You get to create relationships that enhance your life rather than hollow it out. You get to exist without apology. You get to take up space. You get to speak. You get to be seen. You get to matter. Not because someone finally decided you're worth their attention, but because you decided you're worth your own attention. Because you came home. Because you remembered that the person you were searching for in him was inside you all along, waiting, patient, ready to be rediscovered, ready to be loved by you. Finally, completely, unconditionally by you. The woman who loved him more than herself doesn't need to keep loving him more than herself. She needs to return that love home, where it was always meant to be directed. She needs to become the woman who loves herself enough to know when to stay and when to leave, when to bend and when to stand firm, when to give and when to receive. She needs to become the woman who understands that real love doesn't require self-destruction. Real love amplifies. Real love says, be more of yourself, and I'll celebrate you. Real love doesn't make you small. It helps you expand. You are not too much. You were never too much. You were just with someone who didn't have the capacity to hold all of you. And that's information. That's clarity. That's the universe showing you that you need more space than what you've been inhabiting. So take it. Take up space. Take up all the room you need. Speak at full volume. Want without apologizing. Need without shrinking. Exist without editing yourself into someone else's preferred version. Exist as you. Messy, complex, brilliant, flawed, humans, alive, fully, unapologetically, courageously alive. This is your moment, your turning point, your chance to choose differently, to love differently, to live differently. Not someday, not when he changes, not when conditions are perfect. Now, right now, come home. The woman you've been waiting to become has been waiting for you to remember she already exists. Because silence never made anyone visible, returning home is how you're finally seen.